Morning. Ooh. Today, we examine a critical threat, China's rapid advancement in both its civilian and military space programs. We must understand what this means for U.S. national security, technological leadership, and global influence. What's happening in China's commercial and military space industry follows a similar and familiar pattern. We've seen it with semiconductors, with Huawei, with solar panels, with batteries, electric cars, and with biotech. China is following its proven playbook. It is systematically building the manufacturing and R&D infrastructure to iterate rapidly and seize dominance in space. China observers routinely talk about China's civil-military fusion. Let's be clear-eyed. China is pursuing a whole-of-nation approach to compress decades of American and European space innovation into just a few years, positioning it to leapfrog ahead. China has fueled its space ambitions through all of its familiar illegal and gray zone tactics: cyber theft, deceptive joint ventures, forced technology transfers, talent recruitment programs, academic espionage, lawfare, hostile takeovers, and strategic acquisitions that ultimately relocate technology to Chinese soil. During our recent Made in China 2025 hearing, Dr. Drew Endy warned that we have 1,000 days to not lose in biotech. The same urgency applies to space. We have no time to waste. Losing in space would mean surrendering our military advantage, economic opportunities, and the ability to set international norms. Imagine an alternative history where America didn't lead in space. It's not science fiction to say our world would look dramatically different. The original Sputnik moment, served as a catalyst for action. The space race with the Soviet Union defined the mid-20th century. Our competition with China in space will shape the 21st century. Since the Commission's last hearing on this topic in 2019, China's space ambitions have become achievements. Their civilian space milestones are not merely symbolic. They are calculated moves to challenge U.S. leadership. By 2030, China plans to land on the moon and return samples from Mars. By 2035, they aim to establish an operational lunar research station. By the 2040s, China plans to expand its lunar base and explore beyond Mars and Jupiter. These are not distant dreams. They are concrete steps in a strategy to cement China's position as a global space power. China's ambitions extend far beyond exploration. Their commercial space sector is booming. Once dominated by state-owned giants, China's commercial space industry expanded after 2014. The government opened the door to private investment. A new wave of companies has surged into the market. China's market has more than doubled from 2019 to $268 billion in 2023 and are estimated to get to $900 billion by 2029. China's companies are racing to deploy reusable launch rockets and mega space constellations. They aim to crowd out U.S. companies and dominate space in the near term. China is already deploying cutting-edge quantum satellites while U.S. companies trail behind. Meanwhile, China's crewed space station and ambitious lunar mission plans seek to challenge American leadership in human spaceflight as well. This is not about technological bragging rights. China's expanding space power poses real military and economic challenges. The PLA's counter space capabilities are advancing as well. Beijing's influence over the global space governance is growing too. As Carrie Bingham, a former Department of Defense leader and leading expert on space policy, recently warned, our space sector, the U.S. space sector, has long been an advantage for the United States. We need to keep that advantage. The United States cannot afford complacency. Our technological innovation, talent development, and military readiness are being tested. Today, we'll hear from General Chance Saltzman, Chief of the Space Operations for the U.S. Space Force. He will provide insights on the strategic stakes of U.S.-China competition in space, explain how the Department of Defense is preparing increasingly contested domain, and following General Saltzman, we'll have a panel of experts to further explore issues related to U.S.-China competition in space. So, before I turn it to my dear friend, Commissioner Sims, let me thank the witnesses for their testimonies today. Thank you to the Senate Help Committee for allowing us to use this new and renovated beautiful hearing room, and to Commissioner Sims for his shared interest in this important topic. Commissioner Sims.
Thank you, Commissioner Teichen. General Saltzman, thanks for taking the time to come down and speak with us today. The space race of the 20th century captured the imaginations and the ambitions of the American people. However, before NASA's Apollo 11 delivered one giant leap for mankind, the Soviet Union's Sputnik 1 raised fears of the capabilities that could be unleashed by United States adversaries. The question today is, Will the next Sputnik moment be made in China? Or will the United States once again lead the way in the new space race? Now, as it was then, the country who wins this race toward the stars will likely also be the country who's this century's defining power here on Earth. During my tenure in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence under the leadership of then DNI John Ratcliffe, space was made a priority intelligence domain, and Space Force was added as the 18th member of the U.S. intelligence community. That was just over 4 years ago. Earlier this year, I helped lead the transition of administrations inside one of our intelligence agencies. And as I got up to speed on various challenges and opportunities, I was struck by the progress that the People's Republic of China had made in some of the critical technologies that will define the future, including in space. China has become a peer competitor, and in some areas, the world's leader in key technologies where they were not on our level just a few short years ago. According to ODNI's annual threat assessment released last week, China has achieved world-class status in all but a few space technologies. This development has enormous geopolitical, economic, and military implications, which I look forward to discussing in today's hearing. The United States, our government, our private industry, and our people must have a sense of urgency to win Space Race 2.0, but we should also have the confidence of knowing that we have won before and we are well positioned to win again. The U.S. remains the global leader in launch capabilities. Our commercial space industry is the envy of the world. No other country is catching rockets with chopsticks so they can be sent back out into space again. The Trump administration has ambitious goals for the Golden Dome missile defense shield, whose success will demand continued innovation in space-based assets. We're going back to the moon, and God willing, we'll be the first country to plant our flag on Mars. I look forward to the testimonies from our witnesses today as we seek to retain U.S. space superiority in the 21st century.
General Saltzman, I have this long introduction about you that I will forgo reading and put in the record and turn the microphone over to you. I will note that General Saltzman is a native of Kentucky and went to Boston University. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Commissioner Kuyken, Commissioner Sims, Madam Chair, Mr. Vice Chair, to all the members of the Commission. Thank you for inviting me to testify today. The space domain plays an increasingly vital role in making the modern American way of life possible. China's pursuit of its ambitions in the domain could present a powerful destabilizing force to our economy and our national security. Today, more than half of the 16 sectors of critical national infrastructure depend on satellites. A third of our crops are grown using weather data from space. Internet and cellular service relies on satellites for optimization and resiliency. Modern transportation and logistics would be impossible without the global positioning system, and the timing signal it provides serves as the basis for digital finance and e-commerce transactions. Undoubtedly, space underpins our nation's economic prosperity, but it also provides the backbone for our national security. Today's joint force is built and sized around the assumption that space will be there when needed. Setting aside the obvious examples, many of our most important weapons depend on GPS guidance to hit their targets. And the rapid collection and flow of data from space is the basis for the way we mass and maneuver fires in support of battlefield objectives. Simply put, space matters more and more every single day, and a significant amount of our capability is built, sustained, and operated by the U.S. Space Force. Unfortunately, we are not alone in recognizing the incredible strategic advantage offered by space. Over the last 2 decades, our competitors, China in particular, have invested heavily in counter-space threats, kinetic and non-kinetic weapons that can deny, degrade, or destroy our satellites. In 2007, I stood on the operations floor in the Joint Space Operations Center, Vandenberg Space Force Base, and I watched China test an anti-satellite missile for the first time. Clearly, from a military perspective, Beijing understands that the space domain is a key enabler of long-range precision strike, as well as information gathering and dissemination, which makes it foundational to the projection of national power. In the near term, China's investments in reusable launch vehicles and on-orbit refueling represent an inflection point in space access that may result in China overtaking U.S. leadership in the domain. In the face of this competition, the Space Force was established in 2019 to reshape the way the U.S. projects power in space. Armed services are unlike any other organization and federal government. They unify people, resources, and vision for one purpose: to contest and control geographic domains with military force. Their formative purpose is domain superiority, ensuring freedom of access for our forces while denying the same to our adversaries. Just as the Navy is purpose-built to secure the sea lanes, the Space Force must stand ready to gain and maintain superiority in space. In the process, the Space Force must confront a unique challenge. We are the first new military service in over 72 years, and we've had to ask ourselves fundamental questions that other services answered generations ago. Transforming the legacy thinking and processes we inherited from Air Force Space Command has been an enormous task, and I like to explain it like this. In the past, we operated like the merchant marine, and our focus was on efficiently delivering services in a benign environment. But space has become a warfighting domain, and you do not ask the merchant marine to secure the sea lanes. For that, you need a Navy. You need an organization devoted to controlling the domain so that you can access it and exploit it. You need fundamentally different equipment, operational concepts, training, everything recontextualized through the lens of military readiness. In other words, you need a Space Force. Other space agencies do incredible work, but they are not the Title X armed service entrusted with designing, developing, generating, and employing military force. We are. We have made tremendous progress over the past 5 years, but the reality is that we still have a long way to go. Last year, the PLA's budget increased by 7%, with what I determined to be stable funding and stable requirements. Meanwhile, in absolute terms, the Space Force is shrinking. Dollars appropriated are less each year since 2023. Especially with regard to our newest and most vital mission, space control, we lack the force structure we need to execute our missions in the manner of our choosing. As the Chief of Space Operations, I will tell you that my primary focus is transforming the force into a warfighting organization. This means new equipment, new training, new operational concepts, and doctrine. There is no single part of this effort that resolves the challenge. We cannot just focus on acquiring new technology. We must transform the entire enterprise. We must build the entire force and all its elements, people, and processes, because systems are useless without minds to direct them. Our Guardians are uniquely and specifically trained, educated, and experienced in space warfighting, but we have given them a heavy burden in defense of our nation. Now, while I'm speaking to you as a military service chief, the problem we face before us is not simply a military one. What is clear to me is that we must better understand as a nation the vital role that space plays in the health and welfare of our nation. And in the face of a competitor with capability to destabilize all of that, we must unify behind a whole-of-government approach that ensures the safety, security, and sustainability of the space domain. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you all today and share my thoughts and concerns on a topic I think will be the generational challenge of our times. And I'm happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, General Saltzman. Appreciate that opening statement. You were recently quoted as saying that China's growth in space was mind-boggling. I've spent a lot of years working alongside general officers, and I rarely hear them use terms like mind-boggling. It's usually sort of too hyperbolic. But I think you were trying to send a message with this. So in your view, just give us your sense of that. And my follow-up question to it, so you can just roll them both into the same thing, is have we made similar mind-boggling investments in space? I think your opening statement sort of answers it, but I want to give it a chance to just sort of put the two things in perspective.
Well, thank you for that. And you're right. I think that word was specifically chosen because I wanted to draw attention to the difference. And the way I would characterize it is I'm looking at a government trying to invest in capabilities for its national security, something I've been doing for almost 35 years now. And so when I see what it takes to enable the budget process, the requirements process, the working with the industry, bringing in good ideas, transforming and putting those capabilities in the hands of our operators, and I see how our government does it, and then I look at what the PRC has been able to do in relatively short order, in the last 10, 15, 20 years, if you give them the full benefit of the doubt, I believe mind-boggling is a pretty good word to describe. It's been impressive. As I mentioned, looks like stable, very focused funding. It looks like their requirements and their vision has not really wavered from what they've been trying to achieve, and they've very rapidly put this capability into operational use. Compared to us, I would say that we are working through some of the policy considerations. We are working through a long-term vision. It took us a while to think through that we need a separate organization. I mentioned the PRC's ASAT test in 2007 that I got to witness firsthand. And I sometimes hearken back and think of that as really a defining moment that really put us on a path to recognize that the domain was contested and that we might need a new organizational structure to handle that. That was 2007, and it took another 12 years before we decided to put the Space Force into being. So we move a little more methodically in the U.S. government, and so that's why in comparison, I see us on a slower learning curve with regards to contesting the space domain.
That's helpful. Thank you. One of the things that the national security community is always sort of pressing on is this having the Senate ratify the UN Law of the Sea Treaty. And as I was reading your testimony, this sort of analogy came to mind, and thinking about space as the global commons in a similar way to we think about the Law of the Sea Treaty. How would you assess China treats space? Do they treat it similar to the way they treat the maritime law and maritime norms? How should we think about that problem set?
I think they're opportunistic. I think it's a good analogy. I think there is a lot about the maritime domain that we can learn from. The difference, of course, being we've had seafaring nations for millennia. And we've learned over the years through trial, through error, through accidents, through wars, what the rules of the road should be and how best to operate with a global commons that everyone can share, but also protect its own interests. And we simply have only been in the space domain thinking about it that way since 1957. You mentioned Sputnik 1. So I think we are still very early in the process of developing those rules of the road. And I think the PRC can best be characterized as taking advantage of that early domain and being opportunistic and seeing what they can get away with to some degree. And that's where I think we call on like-minded nations to talk about responsible behaviors in space, trying to set those norms so that we can call out aggressive or irresponsible behavior more specifically.
That's very helpful. One of the other areas that, when people think about space, they always think about outer space. They rarely think about all of the ground infrastructure and sort of associated supply chains that are involved in these things. How should we think about sort of ground infrastructure from our perspective, supply chain that supports it, and then how should we think about that in the case of China?
Without the ground infrastructure to support satellites, satellites are just debris. They can't do their missions if we can't talk to them, if we can't pull the data down, if we can't receive the usefulness and the advantages that they offer. It requires a ground network to do that. If you need any more evidence of that fact, look at one of the first attacks the Russians made against Ukraine. It was a ground cyber attack against the ground network of Viasat. So they had a counter space capability executed through the ground network. And so the networks, the ground infrastructure is vital. It's part and parcel with how we do the space business. We can't live without it. That's why one of our major emphasis areas is the ground network, cyber protection, cyber defense of those networks, and we have to make sure we account for it. The industrial base, the supply chains, equally critical because we are relying on our industrial base to push the technology, to push innovations. And if we don't have those solid supply chains that we can count on, that are assured, then we will suffer and fall further behind.
You actually kind of got to part of my next question, which was lessons learned from Ukraine. It sounds like one is the sort of the importance of ground infrastructure. As we sort of think about a potential Taiwan conflict or any other future conflict, how should we think about lessons learned from Russia-Ukraine?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I certainly do always list that ground attack, making sure we understand that cyber defenses and how critical the ground networks are. So I certainly count that amongst the lessons. The other big one for me, and this goes back to some comments I made in my opening statement, As a military service, I have to present an entire capability of equipment, people, processes, concepts. That's what a military force is. And one of the things I observed, and I will just say it's an observation at this point, it's hard to learn lessons in the middle of a conflict like that. But one of the lessons is, if you have exquisite technology, that's necessary sometimes to be effective, but it's not sufficient. If you don't have the sustainment, if you don't have the operational concepts, if you don't have the practice of how the equipment works together with others, a combined armed approach, you're not going to be as effective. And I think we saw that in some of the Russian employment of their capabilities. They had a very capable military, but they didn't necessarily have the tail behind it, the sustainment, the operational concepts to work together to really take advantage of those technologies. Therefore, I'm very conscious of that. It's one thing to build satellites, to build the ground infrastructure, but if I'm not also training the operators, making sure that our capabilities are integrated with the broader Department of Defense, the joint force, it's not going to be as effective as it needs to be. And so those operational concepts are also high on my list of priorities.
Thank you, General Saltzman. I'll turn it over to Commissioner Sims.
Thank you, Commissioner Kuiken. General, what are some of the counter space capabilities that you are most focused on? And when I'm thinking about this question, one of the things I think that it's hard for the public to wrap their head around is, what does conflict in space even look like? And if that's where things went, God forbid, what are the implications here on Earth? So, one, help us understand what that looks like. And then second, what counter space capabilities is China developing today that you're most focused on that would have implications for that?
Thank you for that. I do feel like I spend a lot of time trying to educate people in this new domain of war. And I think the easiest way to think about it is if we can visualize or at least understand the effects that we gain advantage from space. The ability to surveil globally, whether it's weather data, whether it's intelligence information, whether we're surveilling the Earth to look for missile launches and the data that we provide. The ability to use satellites to our advantage is the reason we really want to be in space. It's to take advantage of it. And there's economic reasons with communications, et cetera. And so what war looks like is using weapons to deny an adversary access to those capabilities. So the PRC has built systems that can actually deny us the ability to use our satellites the way we want to. And so what I also describe is 6 basic categories of space weapons. And they're really divided into 2 parts. There's ground-based weapons and space-based weapons. And each of those areas has the same 3 kinds of weapons. There's directed energy, there's RF, like jammers, and then there's kinetic. And that's 2 things run together to create some sort of explosion, some sort of destructive force. So kinetic weapons, directed energy weapons, and RF jammers. Those can be on orbit, those can be on the ground pointed up. The PRC is investing heavily in all 6 categories. Right now, we are not investing in all 6 categories. We're resource limited, and we're trying to figure out which ones we could get the most utility out of early on. The reason you need all 6 categories is because they're all not best suited for all targets that you might try to hold at risk. And so we start to balance, are we trying to counter a low Earth orbit capability? Are we looking at a geosynchronous capability? Those would require different kinds of weapons. And are we trying to deny, disrupt, degrade, or God forbid, destroy? What is the end effect that's really necessary? And I'll just conclude by saying we believe in responsible counter space. Destroying something on orbit, as we've seen with the Chinese in 2007 and the Russians in 2021, the debris that's generated by a destructive force on orbit can be catastrophic for all of the users of the space domain. And so that is I feel, the last resort, and something that we don't want to create this long-lasting hazardous debris field that can start to make the domain far less sustainable.
So you said China is investing in all 6 of these categories, but we are not. What are the categories right now that the U.S. is not investing in that you feel strongly that we should be doing more in?
I won't go into too many specifics on that, but I will say our initial energy, and some of this is because of the technology readiness level in our industry, is mostly ground-based, looking up to space. So in the RF jamming environment, for example, exploring those areas. As you start to move to orbit, the technological threshold is a little higher, and so we've not put our dollars there initially. And so we are more interested right now in ground-based capabilities.
So you've done a good job kind of painting a picture of what conflict in space may look like and the different ways that could play out. With that in mind, how resilient would you assess our current space capabilities to be in response to some of China's counter space capabilities?
I start that conversation by saying that it's an important imperative that the Space Force build an architecture that denies first mover advantage. So if you'll allow me, first mover advantage is where in a given conflict, the offense has an advantage over a defensive position. And that in that condition, you're incentivized to attack first. This happens periodically in the history of warfare based on technology, whether the offense or the defense has an advantage. Right now in space, because of the way we've designed our architectures, mostly for a benign environment, orbits are very predictable. Satellites don't have organic defensive capabilities. It's not hard to pick them out as targets, quite frankly. That gives the offense an advantage. That gives an incentive to strike first, and we have to try to deny that. So I think that because the systems were designed when we were more like a merchant marine, back to my analogy, we weren't thinking about combat attrition. We weren't thinking about effects of an adversary. We were thinking about what's the cheapest way to do the mission and how can we make those satellites last as long as possible. That's not a defensive posture, that's a utility posture. And so now we are actively trying to invest in changing that level of resiliency. One of the ways we're doing that is instead of using maybe 4 to 6 large, very redundant satellites in geosynchronous to perform missile warning, those 4 to 6 satellites might be easy targets to hit. But if we proliferate that mission across low Earth orbit and use hundreds of satellites to perform missile warning instead of just a few geosynchronous satellites, you change the targeting calculus for an adversary. Now they have to raise the threshold of violence in space to attack a lot of satellites to achieve that same effect on the missile warning mission. That creates a level of resiliency when you raise that threshold.
So one last question for you. I want to kind of zoom out some. I mentioned in my opening statement that I had kind of a 4-year gap in my consumption of intelligence around this, and I was struck when I came back in earlier this year by the progress that the PRC had made and some of the real critical technologies in the space domain, certainly, but across the board. I would be curious to hear your kind of big picture assessment of if the PRC continues on the trajectory that it's going in developing its capabilities, the United States continues on the trajectory that we're going in developing our space capabilities. How do you see that playing out?
Yeah, I don't like the curves that you've just kind of defined there. I don't like the slope of those curves. I think if in the last few years, one of the big changes that I think is noteworthy is we recognized in 2007 and in the following years after that they were investing heavily in the counter space capabilities to deny us the use of our satellites. The bigger change in the last 10 years, I think, is now they've built this, what we called a kill web. But in essence, it's a space-enabled targeting set of constellations. The ability to find, fix, track, target our terrestrial forces, that's what has grown most impressively over the last decades. Hundreds of satellites used for this purpose. So that means it's no longer, it's still necessary to protect our satellites, but that's not sufficient. Now we have to be able to deny the PRC, for example, the use of their satellites against our forces. That's a new mission set and really rounds out what we say it means to have space superiority, to use space control, protect ours, but also deny theirs. And that's what we're trying to invest more in.
General, thank you for your testimony today. It's been very, very helpful. Thank you.
Commissioner Brands.
Good morning, General. Thanks for being here. This first question is sort of an extension of the question that Commissioner Sims just asked. So it sounds like from your written testimony and your answers here that you think China is fairly well advanced on its trajectory to become the world's preeminent space power, which is their ambition. Could you just sketch out in a little bit more detail what are the implications of China achieving that status for the United States in peacetime and then in conflict? Well,
and I think it's worth mentioning too that I'm still pretty satisfied with the U.S. Space Force. I want to say that, and I hope that sounds understated, because we're still an amazing military space organization. We just have a much broader set of missions than what we see the PRC focusing on. They're very clear in that they have a Western Pacific mindset. They're able to husband their resources around all the capabilities in that area. We have much more global reach, more global concerns. And so it's their focus that's allowed them to be most dangerous and so fast in putting those capabilities together. But I've also tried to be pretty clear in saying that the modern battlefield has to account for the space domain. If we can't continue to protect our use of the domain and we can't deny an adversary, it's going to be tough to meet military objectives in any of the other domains. We are not a joint force, a multi-domain force, just because it sounds good. We're a multi-domain force because we have to be. That's what it's going to take for modern battlefield success. And I think that when we see the space domain being contested by a potential adversary, we have to be able to respond to meet them head on.
And to borrow Commissioner Kuiken's analogy, we hear and we see a lot about unsafe and unprofessional Chinese behavior in the air and the sea domains in particular. Do we observe similar things in space, and what's your perspective on that?
Nothing was more irresponsible than destroying a satellite at 500 kilometers altitude. You know, the Fengyang satellite they destroyed in 2007, we are still tracking debris from that explosion here 18 years later. That debris causes hazards to our astronauts on the ISS. We've seen conjunctions with the ISS up 14-fold in the last 10 years. That was an incredibly irresponsible event, and I think there's large consensus that that's true. Then what we're seeing is operational demonstrations of capabilities that could also be used for purposes beyond what they state they're using them for. I'm talking about like the grappling arm, the ability to grab a satellite and pull it out of its operational orbit. This clearly has concerns for us if it was used that way. So we're watching operational tests of categories of weapons-like, weapons-class satellites, and that's concerning. The last thing I'll add is concern to the magazine depth that we call it. How many missiles are they buying? How much are they stockpiling in order to conduct these anti-satellite engagements? And again, a pretty staggering development.
You mentioned in your written testimony that the United States and Space Force in particular are constrained by essentially an outdated space policy that's based on the assumption of space as a relatively benign environment rather than the increasingly contested environment that it has become. I wonder if you could expand a little bit on that and just say what are the areas in which you think U.S. policy has become most deficient, and what would be the changes necessary to make us more competitive?
Yeah, and I want to be clear on this too, because I don't think this is, I wouldn't characterize this as a policy debate came to the front, it was deliberately considered, and we chose the wrong policy. I don't characterize it that way. I characterize it as, to some degree, space has been a little bit out of sight, out of mind, literally out of sight, out of mind. And so it just hasn't risen to the level where serious policy considerations need to be adjusted. We need to adjust our policies. Every time a particular policy, whether it's testing capabilities or putting resources into a particular kind of capability, when those rise to the right level, generally we can get people to acknowledge, yeah, this is probably a good idea. It's just still a low priority in terms of the policy regime to even take a look at. And so I just feel like we're lagging in the importance of establishing declaratory policy, and establishing the kind of policies we need to move fast.
Thank you very much.
Commissioner Friedberg, our favorite Princeton Tiger, is beaming in from Princeton today.
Thank you very much. And General, thanks very much for your testimony. It's very informative. I wanted to ask you about how we might assess overall the balance in space. It seems that you're describing a situation in which both the United States and China are trying to secure their own ability to use space, including in wartime, and if they need to deny it to the other side. How would you assess where we and they stand in those categories? So our ability to secure space for ourselves, to deny it to them, and the same two categories for China.
Yeah, it sounds like I'm parsing my words. I'm just trying to make sure that we're careful in these oversimplifications. And the word space race gets thrown around quite a bit. And so I get asked often, tell me about the scorecard. Tell me where the balance sheet is on their side versus our side, or who's ahead in the race. And I just try to resist those because it's, as you would imagine, it's far more nuanced and far more complex than that. A race implies a very simple set of rules that everybody understands, and somebody's ahead and somebody's behind, and you cross the finish line and you can determine who the winner is. That obviously is not how you build readiness to contest a domain or continue to use a domain. It's far more nuanced than that. And so to say one person's ahead or the learning curve is faster, these are all very nuanced and to some degree overly simplistic assessments. But I understand why the question is asked. You know, if we're behind, we want to invest more. Is there things we could change if we think on balance we are not where we should be? And so I think that we are still in the midst of a transformation from developing systems that are suitable to a domain which we think will be contested in crisis or conflict, and one that we took advantage of for decades that was largely benign and immune to these sorts of activities. So we are still in the middle of that transformation. Today we are better than we were yesterday. And my goal is that every day we continue to progress in our readiness in the development of the kind of capabilities that will be resilient when it has to perform in what is becoming a more contested and congested domain. It's about speed, it's about what you're comfortable with, and I will just tell you that my job as a service chief is really to never be comfortable. I'm continuously thinking of the worst case scenario. I'm cynical when I look at the nature of the world and how it's progressing. That's my job, is to be that kind of military planner, be ready for our worst day. So I'm not the most objective person to say where we should be or not be, but I just want to leave you with the fact that this is a complicated set of scenarios. We have to continue to invest to transform us so that our capabilities are capable, given that we know the domain is going to be contested and congested, and increasingly so going into the future.
Thank you. Let me just press down on this a little bit more. If I understood you correctly in your written testimony, you suggest that the United States is currently excessively self-constrained in its ability to develop offensive capabilities, so to deny space, if necessary, to China. Is that an accurate reading?
I think the self-constrained is because we have to make decisions based on resourcing and prioritization of those resources. And so could we reprioritize and put more money against space capabilities? Yes. So in the sense that the budget I have is the one I have to build the force with, that is a form of self-constraint. I will tell you that I believe we have more left unfunded than we have funded. I think the new missions that have been given to the Space Force, we still haven't developed the size and set of capabilities necessary to perform those new missions. As I mentioned, space control being first and foremost in those new missions that we've been given. So with new mission requires new resources. And if you don't get those new resources, then your ability to accomplish those new missions is going to be delayed as you try to put the fielded force into being.
So if we are not where we should be, in your view, with regard to our capacity to deny space to China, if we needed to do so, that's more a matter of resources than policy?
I think so. Like I said, my experience is that once the policies rise to the right level and they're actually deliberated, generally the logic carries the day. But if you don't have the resources to buy the things and then request the testing, the policy issue doesn't rise to the right level.
Okay, two questions. One is, I think, a short one, and one maybe longer. We can continue. But regarding the ground-based elements of our space forces, who has the responsibility for defending those?
The short answer is everybody that owns those capabilities. That's a little too broad, probably. For instance, I have cyber forces that are required to protect the mission networks associated with my space capabilities. And so that falls to the service to do the cyber defense of its own critical networks. So each of the service has those. I won't speak for the other agencies across the U.S. government, but I think in general terms, it's if you have a network, you have to make sure that it is cyber safe, cyber compliant, in accordance with the standards set.
And finally, to the extent that you can talk about this, do you envision, or do we envision in our planning, the likelihood that a conflict in space would be protracted, that it wouldn't be over with the first and second shot, but it might go on for days, weeks, months?
I have played war games that it ends quickly and has been protracted. It kind of depends on, it's hard to separate escalation from the escalation that's occurring in the other domains. So if the particular scenario escalates rapidly on land, then it rapidly escalates in support of that in space. If it plays out more slowly, then it is protracted, and you get into a 1 versus 2 versus 3 kind of a situation. But it has the ability to play out quickly, or it could be more protracted if that was the way the other domains were escalating.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner Freeberg. Commissioner Miller.
General, we're very appreciative of you being here today, so thank you very much. There's a lot to be worried about in your testimony, but I think the scariest thing for me was you mentioned that while China's neck and neck with the U.S. in space planes, it's far ahead of the U.S. in quantum satellites. And you break down the trajectory since 2016 when China released its first quantum satellite, 2022, coordination with South Africa and Russia. And you end by noting that the United States has yet to launch its first quantum satellite with a Boeing-led launch plan for 2026. Why are we behind here? Is this a lack of government support? Is it a lack of policy focus? Is it a lack of public-private coordination? What do you see here, and how can we fix it?
Yeah, I'm a little bit tactical on this one, which is to say, I can tell you the realities of why we don't have more capability than we have, but I'm not sure what the root cause is behind why we don't have, and it comes back to resources. If we have the dollars to invest, to develop the technology, to put the launches together, to put the demonstrations together, to learn rapidly, to build operational capabilities, then I think we understand the kinds of shortfalls or opportunities we have that we would invest in. Without those resources, I can't obviously progress the technology. So the real question is, why do we not have the resources? And I think there's not one simple answer to that. It's a myriad of prioritization and focus and other constraints that have been placed on the budget. And so I would hesitate from my position to say why it is that the Space Force doesn't get more resources to invest in these. But I think the tactical answer is with more resources would come more technology development faster.
And do you have one of the things that we do as a commission is recommend actions to Congress. Do you have any specific recommendation to Congress about the quantum satellite? This is something that if something is not top of mind, you're welcome to submit this to us later. But is there anything that we can direct Congress's attention to this in a way of maybe narrowing the China's advantage here?
I have to remind myself of this all the time. I think pretty near term. What is it I can do? If I get a budget tomorrow, what will I spend the money on? What's the first best thing I can do to make the Space Force more ready today than it was yesterday? But I have to fight the urge to stay in the present and think about some of the longer term visions. I think quantum is one of those examples. We have to invest in the science and technology, continue to develop things that we don't completely understand. What's the best use of it? This is going to require experimentation campaigns, a campaign of learning. These are long-term goals, and so continual investment, saying, hey, a portion of our money should be done in these S&T early development projects because we're not sure exactly how it's going to pay off. And so I have to keep reminding myself to invest in those things that have more of a long-term payoff and not get so fixated in the what can I deliver in the next year or two. And so that's how I'm doing it. But that means you have to defend something in the budget process that you can't really articulate what the payoff is going to be. That's an educational process to say, I can't tell you what the return on investment is, but I think we should continue to invest it. I think we should continue to learn here. And in tight fiscal environments, that becomes tougher to defend.
Understood. One of the areas in which you speak about the Chinese narrowing the advantage with us is reusable launch rockets. And I think your testimony notes that experts are predicting that Beijing will be competitive, or Chinese companies will be competitive with SpaceX by 2030. And you mentioned new and innovative approaches, including something that resembles a maglev train with the electromagnetic pull. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I can't speak technically about those particulars. I can say that having watched the military space organizations and industry work for the last 30 plus years, the reusability of rocket launch systems has done two things. One is it's made things a lot cheaper to put on orbit, which means we can just envision maybe it's better if we do this mission from orbit rather than try to do it in one of the other domains. That was a little bit cost prohibitive before. We have less cost prohibitions now that the cost per pound to orbit is lower. That's one. And second is that has created a market because now there are more entrants into space. The industry has expanded. That has created assembly lines and procurement lines of scale that we didn't envision decades ago. Small satellites, having a constellation of thousands of satellites is mind-boggling from where I started in this business. We thought in terms of 1 and 2 and exquisite satellites, procurement chains and economies of scale didn't exist. Now it does. I think the U.S. is taking advantage of that. We are still the world's leader in launch. As soon as those reusability capabilities start to be used in other countries, they will start to catch up and be able to use space for different missions and in different ways, even more resilient ways. If I could just, one additional thing. One of the things that sometimes we don't think about with these mega constellations is the replenishment rate. Because of the way they're designed, because of the small satellite market, the way we build them, we don't expect them to last very long. You know, we used to build satellites for 20-year lifespans. Now we're thinking more in the 5 to 7 year time frame. And while that might be a little more expensive and you have to account for the replenishment capabilities, what it offers you is a chance to refresh the technology on a much faster time cycle. We're still using technology from the 70s on orbit today to do some of our missions because it was designed, because the satellites are still lasting. So our ground architecture has to account for those legacy technologies that are still on orbit. If you're replenishing on a 5-year cycle, you can keep that technology current. And as the industry expands, you can continue to take advantage of that, especially since replenishment is so much cheaper. Those are going to be game changers globally.
I see. I don't have much time, but let me lob one last question, continuing on this relative advantage theme. You talk about GPS and then how Beidou, which was the Chinese satellite system, was recently created, and it is what I think you say GPS capabilities are now substantially inferior to those of China's Beidou. Is that just the reality now? Is there a software fix for GPS? Do we have to build a new system? Is this a place where we should be placing our dollars versus some of these other priorities you're talking about? How do you think about GPS versus Beidou in terms of your priorities?
It's about when it was developed and for what purpose it was developed. Again, ours was developed, the basic concept was developed decades ago. We weren't thinking about benign contested environments with our GPS signal. And so the architecture is just not designed to support that. We are, as quickly as possible, trying to mitigate that with new launches. The 3F satellites are an example that are a step order, a step function better in terms of being able to operate in a contested environment. But we're still trying to re-architect that GPS architecture based on the contested domain. That's not the way it was originally designed.
Thank you, General.
Thank you, Commissioner Miller. Commissioner Price.
Good morning, and thank you, General Saltzman. This has been so interesting. I want to go back to a question several of my fellow commissioners have asked in different ways. Each time you answer, I get a little bit more clarity in my mind on this. You specifically have talked about funding, restrictive policy, and overclassification challenges. Can you when you talk about the struggle with overly restrictive space policy and outdated ways of thinking, give me some examples.
I think a good one, you just mentioned it, is security classification. We've reached a point that I believe there is more state-of-the-world capabilities that we are protecting with classification that we used to reserve for state-of-the-art, if that makes sense. So when something is state-of-the-art, you want to protect it because you have an advantage that maybe others don't. When something is to the point where it's state-of-the-world, everybody has it. So then security classification starts to be a hurdle that you have to clear to collaborate with others. We've started the process of rewriting policy associated with our classification of space capabilities, but we're still developing it. We're still trying to figure out how you shift from classic need to know mindset to a more need to share. How do we collaborate? Sharing with industry partners, explaining to them the operational challenge at a classification level that they can manage is an example.
Okay, trying to get my head around that. So go back to the role of the private space industry working with you. The Chinese obviously have a different model. How do you see that relationship for us here in the United States, and how does it differ? How does it give the Chinese an advantage or a disadvantage?
Our acquisition process is pretty onerous in the United States for a lot of good reasons. I'll say over time we've learned lessons, and every time we learn a lesson about either a failure in acquisition or an oversight misstep, we put documentation in place so that that doesn't happen again. And over time, that makes working through our acquisition process cumbersome. And in order to be fair and good stewards of taxpayer dollars, we have to go through a lot of process to put a contractor on contract to deliver a capability. So I'm not necessarily saying that's right, wrong, or indifferent. I'm just saying that's what it takes to happen. If we wanted to go faster, we've started to explore authorities and different kinds of policies that middle tier acquisition or other transactional authorities that step aside from the traditional acquisition in order to go faster. Separating software development out of what is traditionally around a hardware acquisition process is another example. We've got work to do to take full advantage of that with congressional oversight on top of it, and with the way we do resourcing to have money that we can ship between programs. I'll give you another example. When you hear industry sometimes talk about the need to fail fast, in other words, try something, it doesn't work, you shift to another approach. This is not comfortable in the U.S. government. Failure means taking the money away, not let me try something different sometimes. And so how is it that the U.S. government incentivizes failing fast? I don't know that we've figured that out exactly. That's one of those areas. It's hard to get the U.S. government to innovate. I'm trying to figure out what are the policies and incentive structures that can align to that goal.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think that's why we've privatized so much of this, is because they can then fail fast. You used the merchant marine analogy and also the need to for defense of our commercial industry that's in space. The industry, what kind of role are they playing in helping you think through ways that they can avoid conflict or work with you better?
Well, we wherever we can, we try to include members of industry directly in our operations. We have a commercial integration cell out of Vandenberg, where we have operators of satellite systems that are embedded with our military operators. So we have good exchange of space domain awareness data. For example, what matters, how close is too close? How do we manage the RF spectrum to avoid issues or unintentional interference? So there's good collaboration there. We invite industry partners into our war games to help us think about future concepts and what might be useful or not useful. I think it's become clear to at least the industry partners that I deal with that if a crisis occurs or a conflict occurs in space, you can't really get out of the battle zone. You can't get out of the battlefield. I like to use a picture of the Ukrainian airspace right now, and you just see a nice gap where commercial airliners avoid that airspace at all costs because it's dangerous. That's going to be hard to do when orbital mechanics are in play and you can't really get out of the domain. You can't get out of the war zone if a war extends to space. So they're very incentivized to help us with that. And so they do that through operational concepts. For example, we feel like if we can make it harder to attack a satellite in space, then it raises the threshold where a nation might consider using an attack into space. Maneuver on orbit is one of the ways that you could create resiliency. If a satellite can maneuver away from a missile, then why would you shoot a missile at it? If you know you can't hit it because it has the ability to maneuver. Well, our satellites are not really designed to maneuver, and maneuvering is something we're very conscious about doing because there's a limited amount of fuel and you run the satellite out of gas and now its mission isn't possible. But if you can refuel those satellites on orbit, now suddenly you can maneuver with less regret, and maybe you can start to become more resilient to be able to defend yourself against an attack, and then that reduces the probability of the attack. And so we do feel like industry understands some of the operational challenges and trying to explore technologies that might help us overcome those.
Thank you very much. That's all I have.
Thank you, Commissioner Price. Commissioner Shriver.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. General, let me add my thanks for being here today and sharing your testimony, and thank you for your long distinguished service to our country. I am not somebody who could claim to have any expertise in space, but I've been a China watcher for a long time. And it seems to me when China gets very good at something very quickly, usually you find foreign capital, often U.S. capital. You find foreign technology, oftentimes U.S. technology, witting or unwittingly making it to China. And you find a lot of nefarious activities on the part of the Chinese, theft of intellectual property and the like. So I'm wondering if you want to sort of react to, how much we either wittingly or unwittingly contributed to this, but really more to the what we do about it. And the important question is, are there things we can do to thwart further advancement of Chinese NPLA capabilities, or have they already sort of gone past an inflection point where they've absorbed everything and they're going to indigenize everything and be good enough on their own that thwarting them is sort of beyond our capabilities?
Well, I am certainly not an expert in that area. I feel like I should be asking you questions so that I get smarter about this. I will generally say that we understand that is what happens, and theft of our capabilities is something we take very serious. And so as we start to envision an acquisition strategy for a capability, we actually evaluate the entire supply chain. That work is done. Who's in the companies, who are the subs to those companies, where do they get their parts, where are they manufactured? All of that is evaluated to make sure that that process is assured and we don't have anything sneaking into our systems that might come from somewhere that we're not fully tracking. So I think on the supply chain side, that's already a known issue, and there's a lot of attention given to make sure that we protect ourselves in the acquisition process on that. And then secondly, you start to map out the networks that are involved in a full life cycle of a system, from its early conceptualization and the science and technology that's done, the design work, the risk reduction, all the way through building the system, fielding the system, and sustaining the system. The mapping of the networks is unbelievable, and the number of contractor networks that are connected. And obviously that's a large cyber surface that can be exploited by a country like the PRC that has a tremendous capability. So we had to go to great lengths to try to make sure that those networks are secure, that we monitor them, that we protect them. We have cyber secure standards that we try to make sure is employed at all stages of that. But as you go down that spider web of networks, you get to contractors that we start to lose control over those networks. And so that's a concern that I think we all largely understand is out there and that we need to attend to, and we try to do as much as we can to eliminate that surface area.
Thank you for that answer. That's very helpful. Another thing, just being a longtime China watcher, it strikes me that particularly after the first Gulf War and the early 90s, the Chinese would refer to us as a technological paper tiger, and they talk about how reliant we had become on certain technologies, and space was always included in that description. And then they go and they sort of duplicate and in some cases maybe even exceed where we are in that. So it strikes me that as they develop this more complex kill chain and seek to have persistent surveillance and then ultimately link that to shooters, that they are also themselves creating vulnerabilities. Perhaps this gets into the more sensitive areas, but would you generally agree with that? Would you comment on the vulnerabilities in their kill chain as they develop and acquire these new capabilities in this domain? And are we doing enough to exploit that and take advantage of it?
This is a military conundrum that we all study. Everything you use that creates a strategic advantage can quickly become a strategic vulnerability. That's the nature of it. The more you rely on something, the more devastating it is when it's taken away from you. And so this is just about a balanced approach. When we use the word resiliency, that is what we mean. So even though we might be reliant on something, we've created the conditions where we mitigate its potential for becoming a strategic vulnerability. That is the actions behind making something resilient. So it's addictive because you want those strategic advantages, even if you recognize that there could be vulnerabilities, and you start to convince yourself that you can mitigate those because this is such a tremendous advantage. I see the PRC falling prey to that exact mindset. Hey, there's such a strategic advantage here. It's worth the risk, and now we just have to attend to the risk. And so that's not going to go away. The last thing I'll say along those lines, and again, this is that military mindset. When you see yourself being dependent on something, there is something natural that says, I don't want to be dependent on anything. I want to be able to organically do my mission without depending on anything. We are not structured to have that mindset about space. I used to say that space was kind of the icing on the cake. It just made everything a little better. But now the analogy I use, we're more like the eggs in the batter. You cannot extract it out. We are in there. The force design counts on that. So this idea of what would you do without space is like saying, what would you do without air? What would you do? It just is no longer a part of this. So that means we're fully committed to making sure we can protect against those vulnerabilities so we can continue to leverage the strategic advantage.
Thank you. I guess I have a minute left. This may not be quite sufficient for the question I'm going to ask, but I'll do it anyway. It struck me that if we had the CNO here, Chief of Staff of the Air Force, Chief of Staff of the Army, and we were talking about China, at some point early in the conversation, they would have mentioned partners and allies. And I don't think unless I missed it, that I've heard that. And maybe that's because, we're sort of so prominent in the space and our allies are so far behind. But wondering if you could address cooperation with partners and allies in this greater competition with China in the space domain.
The reason we haven't talked about it is because I made a gross error in not talking about it. This is important. In fact, I had 3 lines of effort when I came into the job a couple of years ago. And that third line of effort is we have to partner to win. And I meant that broadly, allies, partners, and industry, because we are not going to have the resources. We can't take on this mission as fast as we need to without using allies and partners. So when I talked about denying first mover advantage, when I talked about creating a more deterrent posture, a more resilient posture with our space capabilities, one of the elements of that is leveraging our allies and partners. And we've done that to some success, and all of those successes are breeding other successes. If a satellite is owned and operated by several countries, if the PRC wants to attack it, they have to say, I'm willing to attack 3 countries. I believe, again, that raises that threshold of concern, and they might think about it rather than it just being a U.S. only, we're in conflict with the U.S., and so I'm going to attack the one. But it also is capacity. We gain capacity without having the burden of all the cost associated with it. So cost sharing and information sharing and mission sharing is also a part of our force design. Satellite communications is a perfect example. During peacetime, we need far less communication capabilities than we do in a crisis or a conflict. Rather than buying all that I'm going to need for a conflict and hold on to that organically during peacetime, I say, no, I'm going to have this network of partners, and when we fight as a coalition, because we expect to, then I will gain their capacity as well. So I pay attention to their force design and how they're using their capabilities so that I don't buy something redundant that I don't need to. What we're trying to do is pull their concepts into our force design so we can make good fiscal decisions, but understanding that we're going to partner in conflict, we can account for those capabilities in our exercises and operations. So they're critical to our success, and we think about them all the time. Yes,
Thank you, Commissioner Shriver. Commissioner Stivers.
Thank you, General, for being here today. In your testimony, you described how satellite navigation is absolutely integral to battlefield operations. It's my understanding that Beido's satellite system has been integrated across 1.4 billion mobile phones in 140 countries. In response to Commissioner Miller's question, you talked about the technological differences and challenges between Beido and GPS. But can you describe the threat that U.S. and our allies and partners faced from the expansion of Beido to so many countries internationally in terms of the total expansion of Beido?
It's an interesting question because it's about, it's about the narrative. It's about who are you partnering with. It's about how do you align. And if we think about this as this is the PRC narrative versus maybe more of a U.S. narrative, if there's more customers aligning that want to use Beidou and they become transactionally aligned to that country, does that cause us strategic concern? I think it's a question worth answering. I don't know. I don't know that I have all the necessary information to make that assertion. But I like countries that are using the same standards as us. I like them that are building interoperable equipment to the way we're gonna use them in crisis and conflict. Those are our closest partners. And so when I see about partners aligning on the other side, it just makes me a little concerned. But I don't know enough about the actual expansion to be able to comment beyond that. But I think it's a good question to ask.
Okay, thank you. In your testimony, you called for additional resources for space control. You mentioned 6 categories, but is there a line item that you would say is the top priority? You mentioned it's difficult to shift between missions because it always takes away from something else that's important. But in terms of your justification to Congress, your budget requests, what is the top priority, and does that align with the previous budget requests?
Yeah, all of my top priorities are being addressed in some line item. There's not a huge line item that's just below the line. It's more about the resources to go faster and to develop more capacity in each of those areas. And so that's what I try to emphasize. I believe we have all of the basic categories covered. I just don't have the resources to go as fast as I think industry can go or as I think we need to go. That's number one. And then 2 is, it's one thing to have a singular demonstrated capability. It's another to have it operationalized with the capacity to actually achieve an operational effect. So speed and capacity is more the concern than any one item that's not being funded.
So it's more of just a general request for more funding for space control and not a specific category or line.
Yeah, and I'll make one caveat. Yes, sir, but I'll make one caveat to that. As I talk about the transformation from a merchant marine to a Navy, one of the things we have to be able to do, because we don't have combat experience. Thankfully, my operators don't have combat experience in space. Therefore, we practice all of our tactics on simulators. Our simulators don't currently have the level of fidelity to accurately reflect the threats that they're likely to face. And so I'm trying to rapidly increase the capacity of our modeling and simulations. So think ranges, think simulators where operators sit down and practice their tactics against a replicated threat. Pretty low fidelity right now. I'm trying to raise that game so that we can practice and understand that our tactics will work, or maybe they won't work and we need to revise them and give the operators that practice before they get into the crisis. That is one area that I think we have a lot of room to expand that we're not currently doing.
Okay, thank you. That's all for me.
General Saltzman, we've gone through everyone, and I think we just have a couple other questions for you, and then we'll probably give you back some time in your day. You talked about quantum, and as I was listening to you, one of the former commissioners always talk about how this commission sort of tries to look over the horizon and think about issues that are in that long term that you were talking about. Quantum communications is one of them. That was the only one you sort of highlighted. Are there other areas where we should sort of, sort of weird to say over the horizon when we're talking about space, but look over the horizon in terms of technological development, capabilities, et cetera?
So let me not answer your question, but maybe offer something that I'm kind of hoping will help in the long run. I'm trying to stand up Futures Command. And the reason I need a Futures Command is because I'm not sure exactly what 2040 and beyond looks like. I'm not exactly sure what the threat environment looks like. I'm not exactly sure which technologies will be used against me, which technologies I might be able to take advantage of for operational use. And I need a focused group that is able to both just do the thinking that's necessary, to leverage industry, to leverage our science and technology community, to leverage the interagency. What's NASA working on? What are some of the other civil sectors? NOAA, what are they working on that's been useful? And pull that together and truly describe in real detail what that future operating environment looks like. That then, I believe, will allow me to create a specific demand signal back to industry, back to the science and technology community and say, this is what I'm trying to accomplish, and these are the technologies that we think need to be rapidly developed. And so while I can't sit here and say, this is a technology that I think we really got to invest in, what I'm trying to do is build a more fulsome process by which we will routinely identify what those technologies are and make sure there's a very objective demand signal back to the people that can deliver them.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Your merchant marine Navy analogy has really sort of stuck with me here. As I was thinking about it, one of the things I remember when I was still with Leader Schumer was just how many entities across the federal government have roles to play in space. NOAA has roles, NASA has roles, you obviously have roles, the intelligence community as well. In your opening statement, you talked about sort of this whole nation approach that China takes. We haven't really looked at the sort of civ-mil fusion or lack of fusion in the U.S. government or how we're organized with respect to space. Are there any ideas that we should sort of think about in that area to, maybe revitalize the way that we are organized as it relates to space?
I think, this, one of the things that we're trying to do, and I mentioned Futures Command, looking at what are the missions that we're going to be asked to perform as technology is changing, as we can move different missions from maybe what was done in the airborne environment to what could be done in the spaceborne environment. There's going to be a roles and missions discussion. We've kind of evolved the roles and missions between military space and IC space, civil space, R&D space that NASA kind of focuses on. We've evolved to that point, but I don't know if based on the new security environment, we've really crystallized who's responsible for what and define that in terms that we can say, because I'm responsible for this, these are the resources I'm going to need. We're kind of backing into it to some degree. And so a level of formalization of those responsibilities is probably the next step. Okay, we stood up an organization for military space. Now we need to clearly define what those roles and responsibilities are, or even establish a process by which we will evaluate new missions as they're developed to make sure we give them to the right organization.
That's helpful. And then Commissioner Shriver got me thinking about international institutions. The only one I could think of off the top of my head was ITU. And then the only treaty I can think of is the Space Treaty. How should we think about this ecosystem if China has little regard for these institutions or sort of historic legal documents?
Yeah, those are the two that always, those are in the forefront. I'm sure there are others that are behind that, but I think this goes to the point where we're still maturing the community of practice, the community of interest internationally that's going to address the challenges that come up in the space domain. So I think that it's just recognizing that we have work to do, that we have to document these approaches is key. Do we need an international group to do it? Maybe. You mentioned the PRC doesn't really follow those, but that doesn't mean they can ignore them. And sometimes the most important thing you can do to attribute aggressive, irresponsible behavior is define what responsible behavior looks like. Then it becomes clearer that somebody has violated it. And even if they are willfully violating it, at least the international community can comment on it from the same basic standard that's been established by like-minded spacefaring nations. And if that number is 190 and there are two people outside of that, well, two nations outside of that, well, then that says something. And I think that that gives us the power across the international community to apply additional pressure when somebody specifically acts irresponsible based on the defined responsible behaviors.
Thank you. Commissioner Sims?
Thank you, Commissioner Kuiken. You know, I was thinking, General, as you were talking about the need to increase the fidelity of your training platforms, that, you know, we may lose a lot of things to the Chinese, but if we lose at video games, I don't even know what we're doing at this point. America's not losing at video games, Commissioner Stivers. It's not going to happen. I remember in the first term of the Trump administration, sitting in the private dining room off the Oval, where the president was meeting with the NASA administrator and pressing him on going to Mars. Like really getting after it, like, man, we got to go. And I think we've made a lot of progress certainly in that since then, and it's starting to feel a little more within reach. What are the implications of the race to Mars for some of the things that we're talking about today?
If I understand the basic concept, having just looked at it as an amateur, seriously, the launch infrastructure that's going to be required to put vessels headed towards Mars at the right tempo to sustain the effort there is pretty impressive. It's going to be a large effort. Our current launch infrastructure is being stressed to capacity. I did a little basic research, which means I Googled it. You know, how many launches did the USG execute in 2010? So 15 years ago. It feels like yesterday for some of us. There was only about 15 launches. 14 came out of Cape Canaveral and the Kennedy Space Complex. 14 launches. This year we're going to do almost 100. I think 93 is scheduled. 7, 8 times as many launches. Same infrastructure. Same basic infrastructure, same basic manning levels to support. It's time to revisit the launch infrastructure as we think about what it would take to actually go to the next level of space exploration, space utilities, how much we're going to put on orbit for national security. We've got to build and commit to an infrastructure to support that. It's not always the fun stuff. Nobody likes to do foundation work when they just want to remodel the kitchen, but that is critical work that has to be done, and it's not going to be cheap. But these are big rockets that are going to require new space launch complexes to make sure we can handle it.
One last question I had for you. Do you have, you've gotten into so much today that's been incredible, so thank you again for your testimony. If you had one message for the American people about this topic, and then related to that, if you had one message for Congress about this topic, what would those be?
What I always try to educate the general public on is they don't recognize how much space capabilities affect their everyday lives. It's why I started my kind of oral statement by saying your online banking, your Amazon shopping, paying for gas at the pump, your direct deposit into your bank account, not to mention Google Maps getting you to the store, the fact that the food was put in the store because farmers are able to use GPS and weather data to grow crops. I mean, it's so integrated into our American way of life that I want them to understand that if we don't have those space capabilities, generally the way you live your life will change very dramatically. And because of that, we have to have an organization that protects those capabilities out there. So that's what the Space Force does. It protects the American way of life. And it just sounds so, throw the cape over the shoulder kind, but I believe it. There's so much about it that's important, and we have to protect it. And then what I would say to Congress is once they recognize that, which I think they generally do, I just ask why the Space Force is shrinking in size. That's a disconnect that's really hard to square. How much more important space is becoming, how much more we feel like our national interests require us to defend, and then why is the Space Force shrinking? Thank you.
Commissioner Freeberg, I see you have your hand raised.
Yes, thank you very much. General, I wanted to come back to this question of self-restraint and make sure that I understand what you mean. In your testimony, you say we continue to struggle with overly restricted space policy. And you go on to say we restrain ourselves from doing what is needful to avoid creating improper perceptions of weaponizing space. Could you be a little more specific about what it is that we're restraining ourselves from doing that you think we ought to do?
Yeah, I think the first thing is just the way we talk about space as a warfighting domain. I've tried to be as maybe provocative as possible just in the testimony today. I'm not afraid to say offensive capabilities. I'm not afraid to say defensive capabilities. I'm not afraid to say disrupt, deny, degrade. But I'm conscious of the fact that 10 years ago, I would have been in serious trouble with my bosses, with Congress, with the media would not understand that. It is a radically different environment now because we recognize how critical it is and we recognize what our adversaries are doing to try to deny us those strategic advantages. And as a military service, I think it's understood that my job is to figure out how to use military force to protect our interests. Without the Space Force, you don't have those kind of conversations. You have the oblique conversations. It's important to us. We'll take all prudent actions to protect our interests. We talked in parables to some degree about protecting and defending our space interests. I think that's changed in the narrative, but our policies haven't all caught up with it. So the ability to one industry partner to talk to another industry partner at a classification level that both can be in the same room, we haven't caught up with that yet. Our ability to perform on-orbit testing or on-orbit tactics validation hasn't caught up with it yet. We still have to go to very high levels of approval to do some of the basic things that you would think are just normal operations, testing, tactics development, training. We do that all in simulation, not in actual live practice. We don't practice on live assets very often because of policies that are in place. And I just think we can, as we start to change the narrative around dealing with a contested domain, we just need to catch up all of the policies so that they're consistent. And this is not to say that we're not catching them up. It's just about work that we have to do.
Commissioner Shriver asked you a question about U.S. cooperation with allies with regards to operations in space. I wanted to ask you if you could comment on cooperation between China and Russia. Russia is, of course, one of the original spacefaring nations. Does it still have something useful to offer China? To what extent are those two countries cooperating in peacetime? Is there any suggestion that they might cooperate in wartime?
Yeah. Again, I'm paid to think of the worst case scenarios, and so I always think about what if our two most capable potential adversaries are teaming together, and it's not a pretty picture. I don't think that's something that anybody would choose to be on the opposite side of that war game. It just creates complications. So yes, I do think it's possible that they'll collaborate. I do think that the PRC has developed such a need for space capabilities that the idea of irresponsible behavior by anybody else is starting to affect the way they see the space domain as well. Used to be that you would argue that only the U.S. really took full advantage of space and others didn't need it as much, so it became a vulnerability. Now I think the PRC, for example, certainly needs to use the space capabilities to accomplish what they want to accomplish. And the idea of a destructive satellite, they did not like the 2021 ASAT test by the Russians either. This is irresponsible behavior, and I think they see that it could potentially jeopardize the way they want to use space. So I do think there's a balancing there between the two, but my job is to think about the worst case scenario, and that's where they collude to work against our national interests.
And are there capabilities that Russia has developed over the years that China doesn't yet have, which would be useful to China?
I don't know if there's any capabilities that the PRC hasn't developed. The Russian nesting doll, that was our explanation for the satellite that released a kinetic kill vehicle. That's an interesting technology that's very hard for us to track because of the size, because of when it occurs, the flexibility of it. So that's a Russian capability that we pay very close attention to. We think it's very destabilizing. Our space domain awareness capabilities are still maturing to the point where we can avoid that kind of operational surprise. So those are capabilities that I have to pay close attention to.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Friedberg. Commissioner Stivers.
Commissioner Friedberg stole my question on Russia, but I'd like to focus a little bit more on that. Has China particularly provided space technology or operative support to Russia in the war in Ukraine?
I don't have any details on that.
Okay.
Just don't.
Okay.
General Saltzman, thank you very much for being here today. I really appreciate your testimony. Your staff was excellent to work with in setting this up, so really appreciate that as well. And we look forward to staying in touch.
Great. Thank you very much.